Welcome to this course on the Python programming language. I'm Gary Clarke. I'm a software developer and a course creator, and I hope that you enjoy this 2-hour introductory course. Python is a very versatile back-end programming language which is used by some of the biggest companies in the world and some of the best known platforms, including Facebook, AWS and Google, and it is growing in popularity because of its versatility. It has countless uses in artificial intelligence, deep learning, data science, machine learning, web, cloud computing, automation, analytics. It's a long list and it's only going to continue to grow. Python is ubiquitous. It's becoming the undisputed #1 programming language to learn. It's also the main programming language which is taught in schools, and that is because, despite the powerful things that you can do with Python, it's pleasantly easy to learn and use. It has a nice, simple syntax which is easy for beginners like yourself to follow. It has a large, engaged community with tons of documentation, guides and video tutorials for learners and developers of all levels. And it is actively supported with regular updates to the language, which usually means improved features which make life simpler for the developer. And it is beginner level learners that this course is aimed at, because if you want to go on to use Python for data science, artificial intelligence, automation, or for one of its many uses, you first need to have a very good understanding of the basics. There are not many Python courses which include regular small code challenges to ensure maximum learning, and that gap is what this course aims to address. I take full responsibility for your learning. After completing this course, you'll be able to read and write Python code, you'll be able to apply what you've learnt to solve problems, you'll be able to write small useful programs. Code which you see in other people's programs will look and feel more familiar to you, and you perhaps have an advantage over other learners who have simply coded along with other courses without really having had the opportunity to think through problems for themselves before seeing the solution. You can earn a very good living as a Python developer. Python developers are amongst the most sought after and the best paid developers in the world. But obviously, in order to get there, you're going to need to be a good developer, and in order to become a good developer, you'll need to start out with a very good understanding of the language. The goal of this course is not just to bombard you with information, but it's to make sure that you have that understanding. So the way that it works is that I provide you with some information, then I set you a small challenge based on what I've taught you, and then I show you my solution, and we'll just do that recursively, revising what we've already known whilst also building on that knowledge. This course covers all of the data types and the functionality related to them. I'll show you how to write programs and create modules and how to import modules into your own programs. We'll do some common Python-like tasks. We'll check out different programming approaches such as functional programming and object-oriented programming, and all the time we'll be building small projects just to reinforce what we've learnt. In this special 2-hour YouTube edit, I'm going to give you the first few chapters for free, and that will be enough to get you started using some fairly realistic examples taken from the real world. I'll leave a link to the full course in the description so that once you've completed these 2 hours and you're feeling confident, you can then go and have a go at the full course, and that will really take your Python to the next level. Choose high definition for the best viewing experience, and if you'd like to join a growing group of software developers and take your skills to a new level, all you need to do is subscribe, click the little notification icon, and welcome. In this video, what we'll do is get Python installed on your computer. So I'll show you how you can download and install it on Windows and on Mac, and then we'll check some folders to make sure that everything has downloaded that we need. After that, we'll go over to the command prompt on Windows or the terminal on Mac. We'll run a command, make sure that Python can be executed on your computer, and we'll also check the version of Python which has installed. After that, I'll show you a couple of free code editors which are very good and good for using with Python, and how you can download those. In your browser, navigate to this website, python.org. and here is where you can download the Python installer. It should already have guessed which operating system you're using, but if not, you can select that manually. First, we'll run through installation on a Mac. So if I go to the Downloads tab, click on that, and then the big yellow button, Download Python 3.9.6, which at this time of recording is the current version. And then to install it, I just click through all the installation options. I'm just going to choose all the defaults which Python is selecting for me. Mac installation is very straightforward and there's nothing special that you need to do. Once installed, go to your applications folder. You should see a Python folder for the version you've just downloaded. As you can see, I have two here because previously I'd downloaded 3.8, and then you'll see these files inside of there. Next, go to your terminal and run this simple command python -version, and this will tell you which version of Python is installed, but it's also confirming that Python is working and is executable. Now let's have a look at Windows. Again, python.org, go to the Downloads tab, and in fact you don't need to click it because this pop-up appears. We can click the button on that. That will download the installer for Windows. And then slight difference on this one, there's an extra step. You need to check this box at the bottom which says add Python to path. That's done automatically on Mac, but it's not done automatically on Windows. You need to explicitly tell the installer to do that for you. And then you'll see it installing. Excuse the slides, my screen recording software on Windows is very basic, so it's just as good to use slides here. Once setup is complete, you'll see this message here, and the bit highlighted in red, disable path length limit. Entirely up to you if you want to do that, but I'd maybe recommend doing that. Don't impose limitations on yourself. And again, let's check that everything's installed. So in the start menu, you should see these Python files here, including something called idle, which we'll use on a couple of the lessons. Now let's go to the command prompt and check our installation, and in fact what we'll do here is we'll open the interactive prompt. We can do that by just typing Python and then hit enter. That opens this, which is an interactive prompt where you can type in lines of Python, but only one line at a time. You can't write a whole program in here. So quick example, 1 + 2, which is valid Python code, and it gives you the answer of 3. We can exit that by saying exit followed by parentheses, and then we can check our version of Python the same way we did on Mac with Python -version, and we have Python 3.9.6 installed. Everything's working. Well done so far. Now let's have a look at a couple of very good free code editors. In order to follow along, you'll need a code editor, and these are two that I'd recommend. It's up to you which one you choose. I can't recommend one over the other. They're both very good. Visual Studio Code, very popular, very powerful, and works in a lot of languages. So if you're learning more than one language, then maybe you'd want to go with that. PyCharm is for use with Python only. Now there's two versions. One is the professional version, which you have to pay for, but instead of choosing that, choose the community version, which is free, and make sure you choose the correct version to download, because you now have the Intel and Apple Silicon installers. So hopefully now you've managed to download and install Python. If you did encounter any problems with installation, then just leave a comment in the discussion below, and no doubt someone will be along to help you. Now that we've got the boring stuff out of the way, we are ready to go ahead and learn some of this awesome programming language that is Python. Okay, in this first recording we're going to write our first Python code, but it's going to be very basic, nice gentle start. We're simply going to have a look at some numbers. The two different types of numbers we're going to look at are integers. You'll probably know these as whole numbers because they don't have decimal points and decimal places. And we'll also look at floating point numbers, otherwise referred to as floats, and these do have decimal points and decimal places. After that, we'll do some basic maths using operators plus, minus, multiplication and division, because in any programming language you'll always do quite a lot of basic maths. And then after that, we'll use parentheses to alter the outcome of a mathematical formula, and we'll finish off with exponents. So we'll take some numbers and we'll cube them, square them, whatever. And so, like I say, these are things that you'll do quite commonly in all programming languages, and so it's something which you should be fairly familiar with, and it's an easy place to start. The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use a command terminal. So on Mac, I'm going to use terminal. In fact, I'm going to use a replacement for terminal, which does the same thing. On Windows, if you're using Windows, then you would use the command prompt, and you can find that by going down to the Start menu in the bottom left-hand corner. In the search box, type CMD and then hit enter, and that will open your command prompt. So I'll show you what. So terminal is what comes installed as standard with Mac. I'll show you this. The reason I'm not going to use this is because it's got like a white screen. I think the black screen looks better. So rather than figure out how to change this, I'll just use something which I tend to use as a replacement all the time anyway, and that is iTerm. And so once you've got your terminal, your prompt open, all you need to do, in fact, I'll just button this up so it's nice and big for you to see, and then you need to type Python, Python. I'm sure you know how to spell it. Hit enter, and you should see this. Basically, if you're in the right place, you'll see Python, and then the version of Python which you have installed. So I have version 3.9.6, and then you'll see these three right angles, and that is basically the prompt where you'll start typing your commands. And so, like I say, we're going to just do some simple numbers. Integers are this. So 1 is an integer because there's no decimal place. 5 is an integer. 100 is an integer. A floating point number, otherwise known as floats, would have a decimal point and decimal places. So this now becomes a floating point number. Okay, and so that's the only two types of numbers we're going to cover in this one. Let's use those to do some basic maths. So you can use all the standard mathematical operators. So 2 plus 3, believe it or not, this is actually valid Python code. We'll hit enter, and this little program will answer the equation for us. So 2 plus 3 is 5. 2 minus 3, and we get -1. So Python handles negative numbers. If you start getting towards the bottom of your prompt and you want to clear it, it's the same command on Mac as it is on Windows. You hold down Control and press L, and that gives you a nice blank canvas to work with. Let's carry on with some more maths. So multiplication, you actually use the little asterisk. So you hold down Shift and then it's 8. So 2 multiplied by 3 equals 6. And so you'll notice that so far all of our answers have had no decimal point or decimal places. The answers have all been integers. But when we actually divide 2 by 3, we now get a floating point number, 0.66. It has a decimal point and decimal places. An interesting thing about Python is regardless of what you divide or what you divide it by, you will always get a floating point number as the return value. What do I mean by that? So say for example I divide 4 by 2, 2 goes into 4 2 times. So you're thinking, well, that's an integer, there's no decimal point or decimal places. However, look what Python does for us here. It actually puts on a decimal point and a decimal place. So basically, regardless of what you divide in Python, even if the answer should be a whole number, you will get a floating point number back. Okay, let's now have a look at some parentheses. So 2 plus 3 multiplied by 5. The answer to that should be 17, because using order of operations, this is how maths works. Multiplication trumps addition. So 3 times 5 gets worked out first, and then the 2 gets added on, and so we should get an answer of 17. However, what if you wanted to do 2 plus 3 to get 5 and then multiplied that by 5? Well, just like you can do in any maths, you can wrap it in parentheses. So 2 plus 3 equals 5, and it'll work that bit out first because parentheses trumps multiplication. Okay, and so we multiply that by 5. 2 plus 3 times 5, we should get 25. And the answer is indeed 25. Let's finish off with exponents. So this is where you want to square a number or you want to cube a number. So for example, 4 squared means 4 multiplied by 4, okay, which would be 16. And so the way we do that is we do 4, 2 asterisks, and for squared, if you think about when you see it written down, it will be 4 and then the little 2 up in the top corner, superscript or whatever you call it. So 4, 2 asterisks, 1 asterisk for multiplication, 2 asterisks for exponent. And then we put the 2, and so we get an answer of 16. Whoops. I'll just clear this. And then if we want to cube something, how do you think I would do this? For example, if I wanted to cube 5, what you would do is you use 2 asterisks, but we're cubing this time, so we need 5 times 5 times 5, which is 3. So 5, 2 asterisks, 3, and 5 times 5 times 5 should come out at 125. And there you go. And so everything that we've covered in this first lesson, the numbers, the maths, it's all been valid Python, which you can write in Python programs. Like I said at the start, the reason we started here is because A, it's a nice simple place for us to start, but also numbers, mathematical operators are used widespread in all programming languages. And we've also covered a couple of data types there, and there's only a handful of data types, and so they were integer and floating point number. In the next one, we're going to have a look at something called variables. Now what we'll do is we'll move over to using our code editor, which will be a bit more fun than using the command prompt. So things are getting pretty serious now, and then I'll also show you a couple of things like how you can switch between programs so that you can pause me and switch back to your code editor and carry out some of the code which I've just shown you. So this should be fun. Let's create a folder on our desktop called Learn Python. So new folder, right click, then create new folder, Learn Python. Just making sure I've spelt it right. Okay, great stuff. Now what I'll do is I'll open up both VS Code and PyCharm. I'm going to use PyCharm personally because it's what I'm used to using. Okay, so I'll show you that one first. Here we go, PyCharm, there you go, it's hiding. So in my applications folder, I open up PyCharm. It'll take a while to open up and do about a million different things and ask me a load of questions. Get lost. Okay, and so once I'm inside here, I then want to just go up to the top where it says File and then Open. I'm going to open up the folder Learn Python. So it's actually already, I've had a bit of a practice, so we're already at that location, but we'll do it again. Choose this window, and so there we are. It'll give me some more information because it just loves giving me lots of information. And so now I'm in the correct place. I'll do the same with the VS Code. So I've got Visual Studio Code. I'll click and open that. And then it's the same thing here. You click on File, Open, and then Desktop, and then Learn Python. Okay, great stuff. Get rid of all this mumbo jumbo here. Close the side menu. And let's go and write some code. So the folder's empty. What I need to do is add a Python file there. The way I do that is I right click and then it'll give you a thing here which says new Python file, and I'm just going to call it, because we're going to work on variables first, so we'll call this variables intro. And it's telling you there that it's a Python file, that's what this is, and so it'll append on the Python extension, which is py. So there you go, variables intro.py, and then we'll just add a little bit of code in here and we'll run it. So the way we do this is I'm going to show you something called a function. don't get hung up on what it is. We'll come on to this later on, but it's just to prove that our code is running. And what this will do, it will just print out what we type into this print function into the console or wherever we run our code. So print, open parentheses, close parentheses, and in there I just want you to do quotation marks. So if you do single quotes or double quotes, doesn't matter, and then just type the word working. Okay, then go to the end of the line and then just press enter. Not essential that you do that, but I'm just getting rid of the little squiggles and little hints that PyCharm gives me. And then we need to run this. So on a Mac, I press Command and 2. That will open up this little terminal at the bottom. On Windows, it is Control and 2, and that will open the same thing. And then what we need to do is just type Python, Python, and that means that our Python program is going to run the file of which we enter the name. So we then enter the name variables intro. If I start typing VARI and then press tab, it will complete it for me. And so hopefully it will run this file which we've just created, and it's just going to print out the word working, I hope. Okay, great stuff. That's working. Let's now switch over to VS Code and have a go at doing the same thing there. So click on that. Now we need to open up the side menu. Okay, so I do that by pressing this, double click that. That will open the file, and then if I click that again, that should close it. Okay, great. I don't use this as much, so bear with me. To run this in the terminal here, I click on this little run thing, and then it says run a Python file in terminal. So it should open me a terminal. There we go. And what I'm going to do is press Control and L to give me some space. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing as what I did in PyCharm. So Python, and then I think I should be able to start typing variables. VARI, press tab, okay, and then enter, and there we go, we get working. So that's good. Let me now show you how you can switch between programs. So okay, great. So I've opened up one of my videos on YouTube. I'm going to play this. I've got the sound off, and say I want to switch between programs and I want to move on to PyCharm. To pause the video, press space, video now paused, and then on Mac I hold down Command and press tab. That will move me onto the program that I want, so I can switch between all the different programs here. I choose PyCharm, and then I'm back in PyCharm. To close my terminal, I press Command 2, and then I'm back and I can start typing code in my editor. So we'll have a go at switching to Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to hold down Command, then hit Tab. On Windows, hold down Alt and press Tab, not Control and Tab, it's Alt and Tab on Windows. Okay, switch to Visual Studio Code. Okay, and then I want to close my terminal. To close my terminal, I'll press this X, and then we're back in our editor and we can start typing code again. So hopefully you've managed to follow all that. It's quite a lot to take in for one lesson, but basically it's just getting us up and running with our code editor and how we can then write some code into a file and then execute that from our terminal. Okay, good. In the next one we will definitely start working on variables. Okay, let's now have a look at variables. Variables are an essential concept in computer programming, and every programming language uses variables. What are they? Essentially, they're a label which points to a location in memory that holds a particular data value. Let's use a real-world example to try and demonstrate what I mean. So here's a Spotify playlist which I created. There's various pieces of information regarding this playlist. For example, the playlist name, the playlist creator's name, the number of songs, all of these little pieces of information, these pieces of data, they have a location in memory. However, memory locations tend to look like this. Okay, so It wouldn't be very practical for me to write a program that tries to reference data using numbers like that. For a start, I wouldn't know what reference is what, and I'd have to go and look it up. And if I don't know what they mean, then other developers certainly ain't going to know what these numbers mean. So what do we use instead? We use variables, and we just give them human readable names. So for example, going back to my playlist, if we want to reference a playlist name, then why not just give it a name called playlist name. Okay, and the way that this becomes a variable is we need to assign a value to it. We do that with the equal sign. We refer to this as the assignment operator when we're assigning a value to a variable, and then we said that the playlist was called road trip. And there, in that one small line of code, we've actually just created our very first variable. Okay, quick aside, we haven't yet covered strings, but this data type here is a string, basically textual data we refer to in computer science as a string, and it's usually surrounded by single quotes or double quotes. In Python you can use either. We'll get more into that when we do the lesson on strings itself. Let's get back to variables and some of the things that we can do with them. So if you recall the lesson on numbers, we were adding numbers and subtracting. We can do the same thing with variables. So say we're playing a game and we're wanting to add up our scores at this game. So say the current score is 100, and then we have another go, and then we get 200 because we're getting better at it, and then we want to know what the total of all our scores is. So the way we would do that is current score plus new score. But how do we reference this? We need an easy way of referencing it. We create another variable. What would be a good variable name for this? Maybe total score. And so we use the assignment operator, and that will assign the value which gets calculated to the right hand side of the assignment operator and assign it to our new variable. So let's go and print this out. So print, and then inside of the parentheses we pass in the name of the variable, and then we go down to our terminal. And so in order to run this file, I want the Python program to run the file, so I'll type Python, and then the file name is called variables intro. I can start typing it and then hit tab, variables intro, hit enter, and the answer is 300. So hopefully you're finding that fairly straightforward so far. Let's have a talk about why we call them variables. It's basically because the value can vary. So say for example we are creating a web app and it has a form where you enter your name. We create a variable for name, but we don't just want it to be able to hold one name. It wouldn't be a very good computer program if it could only hold the name Catherine. It needs to be variable. It needs to be able to hold different kinds of values. So just to prove that variables can do that, we'll print out name, and then what we'll do is we'll assign it a different value. We'll assign it the value Gary, and then we'll print that out. And so what we should see here is we're assigning Catherine, we're going to print that out, and then we're reassigning it to Gary, and then we'll print that out. And so we'll go and run our program. Quick tip, if you want to run the same command as the last one, just press up. So up arrow, hit enter, and as you can see it prints out Catherine because that is the value held in name when we printed it there. Then we reassigned it, and then it prints out Gary because that is the value when we printed it out there. Okay, let's have a quick chat about what makes up good names. So in Python we always use lowercase, so lowercase for everything. And if we want to separate the words, if we want to use two words in a variable name, we use an underscore. So this name here is okay, but it could be more descriptive. Always use names which are as descriptive as possible. I think a better name for this would be first name, and that tells you exactly what kind of value that holds. And this is important because when I come back to my code in 3 months' time, I can look straight at a variable and know what kind of value I'm expecting that to contain, and also other developers will have a good idea of what kind of value that variable should hold. Very important that. Okay, let's quickly look at some things which you can and can't do with variables. You can have multiple variables which hold the same value. So for example, we have a variable here, first name equals Catherine. We can also have a username variable which also holds the same value. That's not a problem, perfectly fine. We can also assign values to a variable which are of a different type than what were initially assigned to it. So for example, what can we do here? Foo, just for the sake of the fact that I can't think of anything better, equals bar, okay, which is a string. And then what if I want to say foo actually equals the number 10? That's no problem, okay. And so as you can see, we get the string bar and we get the number 10. And here's something that you can't do. You need to assign your variables a value, because if I just wanted to print out something which hadn't yet been defined, as you can see, foo means nothing here. It doesn't have a value. It's not yet a variable. I'll go to the terminal and just show you what I mean by that. And we get an error. So this is probably the first error that you've seen. Don't be alarmed. What I tend to do is with Python, I just read the last line of the error before I go and read any more of it, and that usually gives an idea of what the problem is. It says here name foo is not defined. Basically, this foo here, it means nothing. It has no value. So if I was to change it to 4 and then try again, then Python should be much happier with me. Okay, good. Okay, so there we have variables in a nutshell. Little labels which point to pieces of data, and it makes it easy for us to reference and to use that data. We've done the basics there. Hopefully you've managed to follow along. You don't need to try and memorize this stuff, because we're just going to repeat it and build on it, and it'll all become second nature to you. In the next one, I think what we'll do is we'll have a look at strings, which I briefly introduced in this one. Alright then, up to now we've looked at two different data types, and they were integers, which were whole numbers, and floating point numbers, which were numbers with decimal points and decimal places. We're now going to look at another data type. We're going to see how Python handles textual data. We refer to textual data in Python as a string, and it's the same in a lot of other programming languages. It's quite universal that when you're programming you refer to text as a string. So I think a good way to start this will be to create a new file, and I'll set you a little challenge to see what you've recalled from the previous lesson, because we did a little bit of stuff on strings in that, even though the lesson was mainly about variables. So if I press Command and 1, that opens my sidebar, and then if I press Command N, Control N on Windows, that will give you the option to open, create a new file. I'll go down to Python file, and we will just call this strings, and we'll call it strings-intro, because we'll be going into strings in much depth. We're just going to scratch the surface of them really in this recording. And so what I would like you to do is create a variable which holds your first name and create a variable which holds your last name. So that will prove what you've remembered from the variables lesson, and it will also show what you may have remembered about the brief stuff we did on strings. And so I'll write down what you need to do. This is a comment, so when I use hash and then type some words after that, it's a comment which I leave for myself or for other developers, and it's something which the Python program ignores. It sees the hash, it knows that this is a comment. It's not intended for the computer to read, it's intended for humans to read. Okay, so create a variable which holds your first name, and we'll copy that, and then create a variable which holds your last name. Now what you need to do is pause the recording, make sure you have a go at it, don't just watch it, this isn't Netflix. Give it a go. Once you've had a try, then come back, see what my solution is. And so this is my solution now. Remember what I said about naming things, so if you're going to create a variable which holds a first name, then a good name to call it would be first name. It's meaningful, it means I understand what it means, and it means other developers will be able to read it and also understand what kind of value that variable holds. Last name equals Clarke. And so that is it. That is all you needed to do for this challenge. How did you get on? I hope you managed to do it and that you use sensible names for your variables. Now let's have a look at the single quotes and double quotes and why we mix and match them. So say for example I have a sentence which is, this is Gary's lesson. Okay, as you can see I've got some angry squiggly red lines there, and for some reason these letters after that single quote there have turned grey. Basically Python thinks that this quote here marks the end of the sentence, and so anything after that it doesn't quite understand why it's there. And so what we'll do is we shall print this out. Okay, do you remember how to run a command? It's Python and then the name of the file. So we start typing str, that'll auto complete it. When you hit tab, hit enter, and we have another error. If you remember, we had an error in the last lesson. This one says syntax error, invalid syntax. So what does that mean? Syntax is basically the rules of the code, the rules of the language. So like in human language, we have full stops, we have commas, apostrophes, all little punctuation marks. If you get those things wrong in programming languages, it can be unforgiving. In fact, your program won't work. So whereas in human language you might write a sentence, the other reader will probably know what you mean if you don't have your punctuation spot on. However, programming languages are a lot less forgiving and they'll just throw an error and the program will stop running. So you have to get your syntax absolutely spot on. Now then, how do we fix this? One way to fix this will be to replace these outer single quotes with double quotes, and then that would mark the beginning and the end of the string, and then in that case we can put single quotes within the middle of our string, no problem. Let's go and run this just to prove that I'm not making that up, and as you can see it prints it out, the error's gone, perfectly legitimate syntax. Another way we could have got around that is actually by using something called an escape character. An escape character is basically a backslash which goes before the character that you want to escape. Okay, and so in our case that will be this apostrophe in the middle of our sentence. And so you can see this highlights both the apostrophe and the backslash. It's because PyCharm knows that this is an escape character that I've used. It's not part of the this backslash isn't part of the sentence, and so when we go and print that out it should just show it the same way as what it just did. It doesn't include the backslash, it just escapes the apostrophe and lets the program run, prints out the sentence correctly. Other things you can do with escape characters is you can use them for things like new lines and tabs. So say I get to this is Gary's and I want to put the word lesson on another line, I will do backslash and then the letter N for new line. As you can see, again highlighted, which means it's not going to include the letter N in the word lesson. Go and print the sentence and we should see this is Gary's and then lesson on a separate line. So I press up to run the last command, hit enter, and as you can see this is Gary's new line lesson. Okay, so far so good. Let's now have a look at joining two strings together. We refer to this as concatenation. So when you join two strings together, you are concatenating two strings. Let's have a nice easy example to show you exactly what I mean by that. And so we shall have first part, and that will just be this is, and then second part equals, I'll put a full sentence. Okay, and the way that we join them together is just by using a plus. So what we'll do is we shall create a print function and we'll just put it inside of that. So first part plus second part. Okay, and then we'll go and print this out. Now I'm expecting something to be missing here. Can you have a guess what it might be? If you look at our two parts of the sentence, can you see anything missing which might make this not look quite right? Let's press up, hit enter, and there it is. This is a full sentence, so we need to put a space in between the two. The way we do that is to just actually concatenate a space in there. So add the quotes, space, and then add it to the second part of the sentence, and then if we go and run that again, this is a full sentence with a space in there. Okay, great stuff. Now let me show you another function. So we've briefly touched on functions because print is a function. A function is a reusable piece of code which carries out a specific task. We don't need to know how it performs that task, we just need to know that when we give it that task to do, it's going to do it and it's going to return us a result. And so the print, we've been using that so far. The purpose of print is to print out whatever we pass into it, and so this new function is called len, L-E-N. And what len does is it calculates the length of a string. So for example, if I pass it last name, it will calculate the length of my last name. However, at the moment we can't see the value that's calculated because we also need to print it out, and so you can actually pass the result of len straight in to print, and that's what we shall do here. And then we'll go over to the terminal, press up, hit enter, and the length of my last name is 6. And so I think we're going to end this one with a challenge in similar way to the way we started. What I'd like you to do is concatenate your first name and your last name and store the new value in a variable, and then what I want you to do is, using the len function, calculate the length of your full name. And so these are those instructions in full. Concatenate your first name and last name and store the result in a variable, calculate the length of your full name using the len function, and then I want you to print out both your full name and the length of your full name, so it will be 2 print statements. Okay, pause it, give it a go. Once you've done that, come back and have a look at my solution. Okay, so here we go. I need to concatenate my first name and last name and store it in a variable. So what would be a good name for that variable? I think full name. So full name equals first, and remember we need a space between the first name and last name. So first name plus quotes space plus last name, and then we need to calculate the length of full name using the len function. So why not create another variable? So we shall call this name length equals len, because the len function, we say it's going to return a value. It's going to calculate that value, but it's going to make it available to us. So because it's available to us, we can use the assignment operator and store it in a variable. Don't let that bamboozle you too much at the moment. We're going to cover functions in greater detail. Just accept it for now, and then it'll make a lot more sense later on. So name length equals len, and then we need to calculate the length of full name. Next, we need to print out both full name and the length of full name. So print full name and then print name length. And what I'm going to do is just go and put a little hash in front of this one here so it doesn't print that as well. And by putting a hash in front of your code, it means it comments it out, and then that code won't be executed when you run the file. Okay, so hopefully that's nice and clear here. Let's go and run this in the terminal and see if we get the result that we're expecting. And so I get my full name, Gary Clarke, with a space in it, and we get 11 characters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Perfect. And so that completes strings. I hope you had a go at the challenges. Doesn't matter if you didn't get them, as long as you manage to watch what I did afterwards, see my solution, and then go back and correct yours. Let's move on. Okay, in this one, before we go any further with our Python programming, I thought we'd cover a very important subject, and that is problem solving. The way I'm going to run this is I'm going to set you a small challenge. I think you should encounter a problem throughout that challenge. You'll get an error, and then what I'll do is we'll have a little chat about problem solving, and then I'll show you how I would go about solving that problem. And so if we think back to our strings intro lesson, we printed out our full name, which was a string, and then we printed out the name length, or the length of our name, and that should be an integer. Okay, what I'd like to do now is, remembering what we did on concatenation, is just print out our full name and then our name length. And so we should end up with something like this. So my name, Gary Clarke, and then you can put a dash or whatever, or colon, but we also want to append on the name length using the name length variable which we created. So pause me right now, have a go at that, and then come back, and hopefully you'll have hit that error and we'll be able to solve this together. Okay then, here is how I'm going to do this. So I just want to print, and I have a full name variable, and then I'm going to I need to add on a space, a hyphen, and a space. So space, hyphen, space, and then I want to add on the name length. Okay, and then I'll go to terminal, so command 2, and I'm just going to run this. So Python, and then the file is still strings intro. So strings intro, boosh, and we have an error. So remember what I said about reading the bottom line last. So what we're saying here is type error can only concatenate str, then in parentheses it says not, and it says int in double quotes, and then it says to str. Okay, I'll show you how I would solve that in a minute, but first let's talk about problem solving. Writing code is only a small part of writing code. The biggest part of writing code is solving problems. But when you're just starting out, you have less experience, and so you have less references to past problems, and therefore less references to past solutions. And so it can be hard, it can be frustrating, there can be a lot of swearing. But this isn't something which is unique to you. It's something which every professional developer has lived through, and it's something which you'll have to live through if you want to become a professional developer. It's all part of the development. Being a good developer doesn't mean that you have to be quicker or necessarily smarter. However, being a good developer does mean that you have to have strong problem solvers mentality. So here are some of my tips for solving problems when you feel like you're totally stuck. Number 1, take a break. You'll get to a point where you're just repeating the same steps over and over and expecting that miraculously something different is going to happen. You need to think about something else. You need to take that break. So if it's late at night, go to bed. If it's during the day, go and do some exercise, have a walk, just do anything which will make you think about something else. Because otherwise, like I say, you'll just go round and round in the same circles, thinking the same way. The amount of times where maybe I've been struggling with a problem and I've gone to bed and woke up the next day, solved something in 5 minutes, which I've been going over and over, round and round in circles for 5 hours with the previous day. I've done that so many times. So absolutely top of the pile, take a break. Number 2, believe that you will solve the problem. Every problem has a solution, and with some patience and perseverance, you will find that solution. However, to have that level of patience and perseverance, you need to have absolute belief that you're going to find the solution. And once you have that belief, then you'll be able to analyze a problem much more with greater clarity, and you'll find the solution much more quickly. Number 3, solve the problem yourself. At the level you're at, this is one of the most important parts of your development. Now, when I say solve the problem yourself, I don't mean to say that you can't use Google, you can't use Stack Overflow or other resources. What I'm saying is don't ask other developers to look at your code and give you the answer, because you'll be missing out on a vital learning experience. Stay with the problem, develop that problem solver's mentality, because when you're solving problems in the future, after that, you'll be able to get to that point where you believe that the problem can be solved much more quickly. And also, by solving problems yourself, you'll have more references to problems you've solved and how you arrived at solutions. And you'll be able to think back and think, I've dealt with something like this before, and this is how I solved it. Again, you'll be able to solve the problem much more quickly. And on top of all of that, all professional developers solve their own problems. Okay, tips out of the way, let's have a look at the little problem which we encountered in our code. And so errors are actually quite good. They give you clues as to what might the problem be. If you've not seen them before, your first step is just to take the error, copy it, go over to Google, paste it in, and see what we get. Okay, and so here we have at the top of the pile, how to resolve type error can only concatenate, and it looks like the same problem as what we're having. So we'll click on that, and it's took me to a website called Stack Overflow. And so this is a site, something which you'll commonly hit when you paste in your problems into Google. You'll often get directed to Stack Overflow. Basically, people put code problems here, and then other developers post their answers to the problem. And what it does, it has like a rating system. So if we see here, it tells you there's 6 answers, and then it'll give you the top answer, the one with the most number of upvotes. If you're registered at Stack Overflow, you can upvote or downvote answers. And so this one at the top has 96, and then it drops off 14, 7. And so let's have a look at the top answer and see what it says. Python working a bit differently to JavaScript. For example, the value you are concatenating needs to be the same type, both int or string. And so what we're doing is we've tried concatenating an int onto a string, but this guy here is saying that you can't concatenate an int with a string. They need to be of the same type. And so, like he says, this will give you an error, which is similar to what we're doing. We're trying to concatenate a string to a integer. So here we have full name, which is a string, and then name length is an integer. So exactly the same problem as what we have. And then he's showing that he's getting or he or she is getting the same error. And the way they've solved it is by using this print. So there's a string, and then it looks like they have their integer inside of a function called str. If you're not familiar with what that function is, don't just take it, even though it might make your code work. Actually, take this one step further and let's Google str. Okay, so Python and then str, and then we'll put the parentheses there, hit that, and so it takes us to this Python str function. Let's see what Python str function. Convert the number 3.5 into a string. So here it looks like in this example they're converting a floating point number into a string. Let's check the documentation and see what it has to say. Definition and usage. The str function converts the specified value into a string. Sounds perfect for us. Let's go over to our code and give this a try. So what we want to do is wrap the name length inside of an str function, so we need to put parentheses around that and then close our print parentheses, which as you can see are highlighted. And then over to terminal, press up to run our last command, hit enter. Okay, perfecto. Here we go, Gary Clarke -11. And so what have we done? We've solved the problem there. What we did, we had an error when we ran our code. We weren't familiar with the error, so we took it, copied it, pasted it into Google. That led us to a website called Stack Overflow where someone had proposed a solution. However, even though that solution might work, it contained a function which we were unfamiliar with, and so we took that function, pasted that into Google, and that led us to another site which explained what that function actually did. And so there we solved the problem totally. We now know what that function did, whereas if we'd have just pasted it in, okay, it would have made our code work, but we didn't have full understanding, so that wouldn't have really helped us out in the future. Now we do have full understanding, and we also know that not only will this work with integers, we know that it'll work with floating point numbers, because that is the example which was being used on the website which we visited. So, hope you've enjoyed that, hope you've learned something and that you've had a bit of a think about how to solve your own problems in the future. Let's now move on and work on some more Python code. Okay, in this recording we're going to have a look at functions, because I'm conscious of the fact that we've had a look at some functions, those being print for printing values, and we printed strings and numerical values. Then we used one called len, and that was used to show the length of a string. And then we found one called str, and this is one which we went and looked up and found through the help of Google after we stumbled upon a problem, and what that did is it converted a numerical value into a string value. So before we get started, what I'm going to do is create a brand new file which I'll call functions intro, and I'll paste some little comments in there to myself so I know what I'm going to teach you in this one, and I'll do that behind the scenes. And here is that file. So in the Learn Python folder, where we have our strings intro and our variables intro that we've worked on so far, I've created a new Python file, functions-intro.py. And so I've put some little comments in there just to guide me and know what I'm going to teach you in this one. First off, what are functions? We've briefly touched on it before. They are self-contained pieces of code which perform a certain task, and they're reusable, so we can use the same function in multiple parts of our code. Say for example we have a task and it's quite lengthy, it's quite involved. You wouldn't want to be writing out that code in multiple parts of your code. Instead, if you have a self-contained function which you can pass around, it's much more convenient and it saves you a lot of time, and it also prevents duplication, because if you're writing the same code in multiple parts of your program and then you realize that you need to change some of that code, then what you have to do is you have to go and find every single part where you've written that code and change every single part. Whereas if you have a function which you're reusing and dropping here and there, all you need to do is go back to that function where you created it and just change the part which you created. Okay, so let's go and create our own function. And when you create a function, you actually say you're defining a function. And the way we do it is like this. We start with the letters D, E, F. So that's like a keyword. D, E, F, it means define. And then you give it a name. Like our variables, give it a meaningful name. So for this one, we're going to create a function which just takes your first name and says hello. So for example, we pass your first name in and it'll say hello, your first name. And so for that we'll just call it say hello, and then it takes an input. If you remember the print function, print, then you put an input between the parentheses. And so what we need to do is we need to mark the fact that we're going to take an input which is going to be used in this function, and that input is going to be a first name. So let's call the input first name. Okay, and then what you do is you add a colon, and so we call this the signature. It's the name and also the inputs, and what we need to do then is add the body, i.e. the piece of code which does the work. And so if I, in PyCharm and in Visual Studio Code, if you're writing into a Python file, when you hit return or enter, it will then drop you on to the next line, but you'll notice that it's indented by 4 spaces. That 4 spaces is very important. That shows, that tells Python that you're inside the body of the function. In other programming languages, you'll see things like this, curly braces to show that you're inside the function. However, Python doesn't do that. It's a much more think a much more cleaner syntax, and it uses white spaces instead. So colon, hit enter, and it should automatically do it for you. And so what do we want to do here? We just want to print out hello first name. So print hello, and then can you remember concatenation plus first name. Okay, that's the definition. Let's go and run this and see what happens. So Python functions, the file is called functions, functionsintro.py. Hit enter and nothing has happened. Why is that? Because this is just a definition. We're basically creating the blueprint of what needs to happen. It's a set of instructions. However, those instructions won't be carried out until you call the function. And so the way we call it is the same way we call print, we call len. And so the way we're going to do this is say hello, and then we need to pass in a first name. So I will say Gary, and then we'll go and try our code again, and we get hello Gary. What it has done, it has printed out hello space concatenated with my first name. Okay, so that's actually those 3 points taken care of. Let's now have a look at the difference between functions. So we looked at the print function, and believe it or not, the print function, there's a big difference between how that works and how the len and the str functions work. Print function, it just does something. You give it a name, you give it a string, and it will just print out that string. Whereas the len function and the str function, they actually give you something back. You give them some information, they calculate you a value, and they give you some information back, which you can store in a variable. Let me show you. So we'll say first name equals Gary. Name length equals len, and then we'll pass it the first name. And so what we're doing here is the len function runs, calculates the length of my first name, but then it sends that information back to me, which means I can store it in a variable. So print name length, and we actually get a name length of 4. So let's go and now create our own function which returns a value. And so the way I shall do this is I'll create a function which squares a number. So we need to define it, def, and I'll just call this square, and I'll spell it correctly also, square number. Notice I'm using the exact same formatting as we do for variables, lowercase, and if there's more than one word I'm using a underscore. And so for this you just pass in a number, colon, hit enter, that takes you into the body of the function, and what we want to do is just return. Okay, so by having this return keyword, that means it's going to give you a value back. In fact, we'll calculate that value first. So we'll call it, we'll give it a variable name, squared number equals number. And can you remember how we said that we square a number? 2 asterisks and then 2. And then what we want to do is just return that. So return squared number. And remember, of course, this is just a definition. So at the moment, in fact, I'll show you, if we run this, it's not going to do anything. We need to call it, and we need to call it and also pass in the number that we're going to square. So square number, and we'll just say the number 3. So it'll be 3 times 3. We're expecting a value of 9. It's returning a value, which means we can assign it to a variable. So we shall call this, you can call it anything, but we'll just call it squared. So squared equals, if you get these squiggles by the way, and you're using PyCharm, what I do is I hit Alt and Enter, and it says the first option there, reformat the file, because Python, they have standards and ways that files should be formatted in the correct way. I'll not go into it in great depth, but so Alt and Enter, and then just hit Enter for your first option, and it'll reformat it, and then it'll be happy with you. So it won't give you errors, that kind of stuff, but it's just saying that this is how we like files to be formatted, so it's nice for other developers to read. Okay, I digress. Let's go and run this now. So squared equals square number. We're not going to see anything yet because we need to print it. So we shall print squared, and then we'll go over to the terminal, command 2. If I press up, then I can run the last command, hit enter, and so we get an answer of 9. Okay, time for a little bit of a challenge for you. First off, let me just explain that functions can take more than one. They can have more than one input. They can have as many inputs as you want, I think. So, for example, in this challenge, what I'd like you to do is create a function which adds two numbers together, and I'll start it off for you. So we'll just call it add, and we can just use simple variable names for this. We're going to add number A to number B. The way you add more than one input, or declare more than one input, is you just use a comma and separate them with commas. So add A to B. What I'd like you to do is finish this off. In the body, add A to B. You need to return that value. Then what I want you to do is store that returned value and then print it out in the terminal. Okay, so pause it, or pause me, have a go at that, come back and then have a look at my solution. Okay, so here's my solution. Add A to B. We need a colon, hit enter. That takes you into the body of the function, and so we will just call this C. C equals A plus B, and then I said we need to return the value so that we can use it, so we shall return C. Okay, and then what we need to do is call the function, grab the returned value, or call the function with some numbers. So we'll just use some simple numbers, grab the returned value, and then print that out. So I'm just going to go and comment out this print statement here, otherwise it'll show that as well. Okay, so add, and we shall add 4 and 5. We need to store the returned value, so we shall just call this sum equals add 4 plus 5, so whatever is the sum of 4 plus 5 will get stored in a variable called sum, and then we need to print that out. Print sum. I'm just going to make some space here. Okay, and then we'll go and print it out to the terminal, and we get 9. And so you can try it out with different numbers. We shall call this sum2 equals add, and then we'll add 6 and 7, which should add up to 13, and we'll print them both, in fact. So we'll print sum, and then we'll also print sum2. Go to the terminal, clear that with Control L, press up to run the last command, hit enter, and so there you go. As you can see, you can use the function more than one time in your code, which is really handy, because the alternative would be that you're repeatedly writing that in your code, whereas here you're just dropping in one function in as many different places in your code as you want. And if you think about it, what if you're doing complicated maths? Your function might do something a lot more complicated than this, and so you won't want to be rewriting that out over and over again. And so that's functions. In the next one, I'm going to show you a special kind of function which belongs to certain data types, and they are called methods. Okay, in this recording we're going to carry on from our last lesson, which was on functions, by having a look at a special kind of function which is a method. A method is a function which belongs to something and it is performed by that something. We'll start off by creating a new file in the Learn Python folder, and we'll just call this methods intro. So methods intro. Okay, so I've added some notes there. What do I mean when I say that a method is owned by something? I'd like you to think of a baker. A baker bakes cakes. Now think of a doctor. A doctor doesn't bake cakes, a doctor prescribes medicine. And so the function bake cake belongs to the baker. That's what I mean when I say that the method or the function is owned by a particular object. Now think of prescribed medicine. The prescribed medicine function or method, let's call them methods and we'll get the terminology right. The prescribed medicine method belongs to the doctor. Okay, so I hope that should be fairly easy to understand now. Let's have a go. So let's think of this in terms of our data objects, strings, integers and floats. Strings have certain methods which only they can do. Those methods can't be performed by integers or floating point numbers. For example, I'm going to use a method which is only available to strings called lower, and the way I do it is like this. So we'll start off by just putting my full name. Okay, and the method is called lower. The way that I get my name to perform that method is I add a dot, and as you can see a big menu opens up here with a load of methods which are available only to this type, to string types, and the one I'm looking for is lower. So I'm not going to use autocomplete, I'll just actually type it out myself. So it's the word lower followed by 2 parentheses, because after all this is a function. It's just a function which is being performed by a string. Okay, and so now I'm going to print name. Thinking back to what we said in functions about returning values from functions, the lower method should return a value. So what do you think is going to happen here when I print my name? Python, and then we need the name of the file. I start typing it, press tab, methods intro.py, and it's actually printed my full name. It hasn't lowercased the 2 letters G and C, which start the names Gary and the name Clarke. So the problem here is name does not get altered. The lower method does not alter the name variable. What it does is it takes that name variable, creates a lowercase version and returns it. But as you can see here, we're not handling a returned value. We're just performing the function and carrying on. What we need to do is grab that value which is returned to us, so we can do that by storing it in a variable, and that's what we shall do. So lower, I'll call it lowered name, and then what I'll do is I'll print both name and lowered name. To print more than one value using the print function, you just like when we use the add function in the previous lesson, what you do is you just put a comma between the values. Okay, so print name, and we shall also print lowered name. I'll go over to the terminal. I'm going to clear it with Control and L, press up to run the last command, and so there you go. We have name, which is preserved, has a capital G and a capital C, and then we have the lowered version which was returned from the lower function. So just like our add method when we worked on functions, we're saying we're returning a value. That's exactly what this lower method does. It calculates it, lowercases it, and then returns it. So just to be clear with that one. Okay, now that you've seen me do that, I'm going to set you a little challenge. You might need to do a little bit of research, and you may also need to go back and have a look at the lesson files that we've already created. What I want you to do is find a method which will count the number of a certain letter in your name. So we'll go with the letter A, for example. How many times does the letter A appear in your name? There's a method on which can be performed on strings, which will do this for you. So you may need to do a bit of Googling, or if you're using PyCharm, if you saw what I did when I wrote name and then dot, a menu of method options appeared, so you might be able to do it that way. What I'd like you to do, that value will be returned, so I'd like you to store that in a variable, and then I'd like you to create a string which says the letter A appears in my name, and then using the variable where you've stored the number of times that that letter appears in your name. I want you to use that variable and incorporate it into the string. So have a think about this. An integer is not going to incorporate into a string without a little bit of help. So that's something you're going to have a think about. Maybe go back to the previous lesson files if you can't remember how we solved that particular problem. Pause it now, and then here's my solution. Okay, so first things first, I want to count the number of times that the letter A appears in my name. So we'll store it in a variable, whatever we get back. So we'll call it A count equals, and then name dot. And so the method that you're looking for is called count. And then you pass in the string that you're looking for. So using quotes, I'm looking for the string A. How many times does the string A appear in my name? That will then be stored, returned and stored in a count variable. And then what do I need to do? I need to print out a string which says how many times a count appears in that string. But first, an integer isn't going to incorporate into the sentence, so we need to first convert a count into a string. And so a count string, I think we'll call it, that sounds okay. A count string equals, and it was the str function, str, that converts an integer, which is what we will get back from the count method. So we need to convert the integer a count into a string, and now we should be able to just create this sentence using normal concatenation. Again, we'll store this in a variable. Get used to storing everything which you calculate or create or any concatenations in variables, because you'll probably need to use them in other parts of your program. So it's always good to store these bits in variables. Okay, sentence equals, I'll just copy and paste this. So quotes, the letter A appears in my name, and then I need a space, I need to concatenate, and then it's a count string, and then concatenation, and then quotes to open another string, I need a space, and then the word times. Then we need to go over to terminal, and in fact we need to print out sentence, don't we? So print sentence, go over to terminal, run the last command. The letter A appears in my name 2 times, which is absolutely correct. Gary Clarke, there's one A, and there's the other A there. Okay, how did you get on? Hope you managed to do it. If there was a particular thing that you struggled with, maybe you can go back and revise it. However, what I will say is we're going to cover these things so many times, we're going to go over them and over them. So things like remembering or memorizing stuff, you don't really need to do, because even if you haven't fully remembered how to do something or you haven't fully grasped something, we're going to repeat these things so many times that it will come second nature. So it's through practice that you'll actually remember these things rather than from physically trying to remember. Okay, great stuff. In the next one, we're going to have a look at something called Booleans. Okay, in this recording, we're going to look at our 4th different data type. Up to now, we've looked at 3 others, and they were integers, floating point numbers, and strings, otherwise known as ints, floats, and strings. This one is going to be all about something called Booleans. Booleans are a special data type used in all programming languages, but they can only have one of 2 values. Those values are true or false. Because they can only have 2 values, this makes them really useful, because you can check if an expression evaluates to true, and if it does, you perform one specific action, and if it evaluates to false, then you do something else. So Booleans are used for controlling the flow of our code and making decisions. Let's start this off by creating a file called Booleans intro in our Learn Python folder. So over in Learn Python, new file, Python file, Booleans-intro, and then behind the scenes I'm just going to paste a few notes in there to help myself and know what I'm going to teach you. Let's start off by doing a simple assignment. So A equals 5. We're using a single equal sign, and so we refer to this as a assignment operator because we're assigning the value 5 to the variable A. Now we can use the equal sign in a different way by using two equal signs, a equals 5. What do you think we're doing there? We are actually asking the question, does a equal 5? Okay, and so that is going to return us a result, and that result will be a Boolean value, true or false. So let's print this out and we'll go and inspect that. So print does a equal 5. Over to the terminal, and it's Python, and our file is called booleans intro, and the answer is true. So if I was to change our assignment and say assign the value 6 to a, and I ask the question does a equal 5, naturally I get false, a Boolean value. And so because we're returning a result, this expression gives us back a result. It means that we can actually store it in a variable. So what I'd like you to do is have a go at that. Instead of printing this out, what I'd like you to do is store the result of a is a equal to 5 in a variable, call the variable whatever you want, and then print out the actual variable instead. So pause me, should be fairly simple this, pause me, give that a go, and then come back and see what I do. Okay, so I'll just move my notes up. So what we want to do is remove this print. So I'm just going to delete this, remove that parentheses, and just store it like you store any other value. So we'll call this true or false. Could have called it anything. Okay, so true or false, single equal sign, we're assigning the value, and that value is the returned result of is a equal to 5. And then what we want to do is just print out the variable instead. So true or false. Go and run this. And so we get false because we'd assigned the value to 6. Okay, so I hope that's nice and clear. Now, in Python, there's a handy little function which you can use for checking what data type your variables are or what your pieces of data are. And that function is called type, T-Y-P-E. And as you do more and more Python, you'll use this all the time to check your data types. And so if I want to check, say, just a random string, Gary, and I'll need to print out the result of that because type returns you a result, and I go and print this out in the terminal. And so ignore this bit that says class. We'll come on to discussing that later on in the recordings. The bit you're looking for when you print out type is this, the part that's in quotes, str, which means string. Okay, Gary is a string. So if I was to change the value within the type function to 100, clear my terminal, and then run it again, we're looking at the value between the quotes, and we get int, which of course refers to integer. For a float, so we'll go for a well-known float, 3.14. 3.14 is indeed a float, and so if we want to find out the type of our variable true or false here, true or false, we'll go and print that out, and we get the class Boolean. Okay, good. So in that we've covered 3 new things really. We've looked at a new data type, which is a Boolean. A Boolean can be a true or false value, and it's useful to use it in your code for checking a certain condition and performing one action if it's true or another action if it's false. We also looked at a new operator called the equality operator, which is 2 equal signs. Instead of the 1 equal sign which we use to assign a value, we use 2 equal signs to check if a value is equal to another value. And then we also looked at a handy little function called type, and that lets you know what data type your variable is. And so in the next one, we're going to build on this. We're going to use booleans again, and we're going to look at something called conditionals. Okay, in this recording we're going to look at something called conditionals, and this will build on what we did in the last lesson, which was about booleans, because there are times when programs need to make decisions. In fact, it happens quite a lot. And the way I'll demonstrate this first, just to give us a bit of an idea, is I'm going to try and log into Spotify, and I'm going to first try and log in with the wrong credentials. So if I just enter foobar and try and log in, what has happened there is Spotify has checked my password against a password which is stored in a database to see if they match. Does this password match that password? It's asked a question, and after asking that question, it returns a Boolean result. If that Boolean result is true, password A matched password B, then obviously it will let me log in. However, I entered the wrong password, and so it's followed a different path. The program has gone down a totally different path than if the password was correct. So now I'm going to try and log in with the correct credentials, if I can remember them. And Spotify logs me in. So what has happened there is the Boolean evaluated to true. Password A did match password B. Now do this. Okay, so let's open up a file. I'll paste some notes in there to myself, and we'll create some conditionals ourselves. So in PyCharm, I'm going to the Learn Python folder. I'm going to create a new Python file, and this will be called conditionals intro. So -intro. You'll notice I'm putting -intro on all these files because basically at the moment we're just scratching the surface of these topics, and we're going to cover them in more and more and greater depth. I don't want to go into them and explain everything about strings or everything about numbers all in one go, because you wouldn't remember it. It's best to learn these things in small chunks, build on them, introduce new themes, and as we're introducing new things, we're also revising the stuff we've already learned. It's all part of the learning process, so trust me, this stuff does work. Okay, let me just paste some notes into here for myself. Okay, so I'm going to create two passwords. One is going to be stored password, so we're pretending this is a password which is stored in a database, and the other one is going to be an entered password, and we're pretending this is a password which a user has entered. So fairly straightforward. Stored password, and we'll stick with foobar, and we're just at the moment we're going to go happy path. You call it happy path when everything works, and so the entered password is also going to be set to foobar. So entered password equals foobar. And so conditionals, we have something called an if statement, and we say if this condition is met, if this condition evaluates to true, in other words, then do this. And the way that we do an if statement is we simply start off with the word if, lowercase, and then the statement, the expression. So what we are checking is if the stored password is equal to the entered password. How do we check if two values are equal? We use two equal signs. So if stored password is equal to entered password, and so that's what we are checking, and then at the end of that line you put a colon. So a bit like what you do in functions when you create the signature for a function, you put a colon at the end of the line. If I hit enter on PyCharm, look what happens. It indents it by 4 spaces. So technically it doesn't need to be 4 spaces. However, 4 spaces is what everyone uses. So as far as me and you are concerned, 4 spaces is what it's going to be. And so when you're indented within that 4 spaces, it means you are within the if conditional. So everything that I write in here is code which will only execute if the stored password is equal to the entered password. And so what we shall just do is we shall print, and we'll just pretend that we're logging a user in. Logging the user in. Okay, and so if I want to come out of that conditional, I simply go back to the baseline. So this code that I'm about to write is not indented, which means it does not fall under the if conditional, and so this code which I write here should run every single time. And so this line should display each time. Okay, so let's just have a quick recap. We're going to check if the stored password matches, is equal to the entered password. If that evaluates to true, if stored password does equal the entered password, we're going to print logging the user in. If they don't match, then that line will be ignored because it won't even reach that line. It'll just skip past it because the condition has not been met. But because this line here is outside of that conditional check, that line should run every single time. So let's go over to the terminal, and we are running conditionals intro. So I'll start typing that, COND, press tab, logging the user in, and then this line should display each time. How about if we now go back and change the entered password to one which doesn't match the stored password, and then we shouldn't see that line logging the user in. So I'm just going to change this to fake, and then we'll go back, clear the terminal and run it again. And so we're only seeing the line which will run every time the condition hasn't been met. Stored password is not equal to entered password, so this is false, and so we are only seeing this line here. Okay, now I'm going to show you a new function, which is the input function. It's a handy little thing. It allows us to enter some input, and then we can store that in a variable. So I'm just going to rearrange my notes here. And so instead of hard coding entered password equals fake, what we're going to do is we're going to use the input function. So input, and then you add some prompt text, so you're telling the user to do something. So in our case, this will be please, and we need to put it inside quotes, please enter a password. And then I'll put a little colon and a space. So you'll see this prompt, you enter a password, and then that will be returned from the input function. And if it gets returned from the input function, it means we can store it in a variable. Okay, and so then we're actually going to check an entered password which we really have entered. So I shall go to the terminal and run this. So I press up and enter. Please enter a password. So first I'm going to enter a fake password. Fake. And so it shows the line. This line should display each time. So the line inside of our if conditional has not been executed. However, I shall now go back and I'm going to enter the correct password, which is foobar. Please enter a password, and as you can see, logging the user in. If we think back to when I tried to log into Spotify, we didn't meet the condition, and so I wasn't able to log in, and it gave us an error message. But here we're only really looking at happy path. We're only handling the condition where the passwords match. The way to handle a condition if it isn't met, if it evaluates to false, is we use something called else. And so the else goes underneath the if. Obviously it goes against the baseline because we don't want it to be inside there, because that means it's running if the condition is met. So we say if stored password equals entered password, run this line, else. And so it's the word else followed by colon, and then we're just going to print an alternative message which says the passwords do not match. And so I think this line's redundant now. We can get rid of that. And let's go and actually run this in the terminal. So please enter a password. And so to trigger the else part, I need to enter an incorrect password. So I shall enter fake. The passwords do not match. And so we've learned a couple of new things there. We've built on what we learned about booleans to see how a program can use a boolean value to make a decision. If boolean evaluates to true, do this, else do this. And also we learned a handy new function there, an input function, which prompts you to enter some input, and then it grabs that input and it returns it from the function so that we can store it and use it in the rest of our program. Okay, in this recording we're going to have a look at a few more comparison operators. Just like the double equals, all of these comparison operators will return you a Boolean result. And so we'll start at the top here. I've already pasted in some notes to help me. So equal to, we already know it, but just for thoroughness, I'm going to do them all anyway. Does 5 equal 5? So I'll just use numbers rather than mess about with variables for the time being. And then we'll go and print this out. And so this is Python. And by the way, I've created a file called comparisons.py in the Learn Python file. So that's the file that you need to create. Should have mentioned that from the start. So Python comparisons.py, hit enter. 5 does indeed equal 5. Let's move this down one. And the next one we're looking at is greater than. So this right angle bracket here, you've probably seen it in maths anyway. We're going to say is 5 greater than 5? We'll run this. Obviously 5 isn't greater than 5, however 5 is greater than 1, and so run this and you should get true. Less than is the opposite of the right angle bracket, it's a left bracket, so is 5 less than 1, so we should get false for this. Okay, however 1 is less than 2, so fairly straightforward these ones. Greater or equal. So it's easy to get the syntax wrong on these. Always remember that the equal sign goes on the right hand side of all operators. So if you're doing greater than or equal to, it's the way you say it really, greater or equal. So greater comes first, equal comes second. Is 1 greater or equal than 2? And the answer is false. However, 1 is greater or equal to 1 because it's equal to 1, and 2 should also come to true because 2 is greater or equal to 1. Okay, perfect. And so less than or equal to, so all we need to do is change this to a less than sign. Is 2 less than or equal to 1? So we should get false for this, and then we're going to say 1 is less than or equal to 1 because it's equal. Okay, great stuff. The last one I'll show you is not equal. So this is a special kind of operator. We use the exclamation mark. The exclamation mark is called a negation operator. And so 1 does not equal to 1. What do you think will be the answer there? Let's just go and run this. And it's false because 1 is equal to 1. However, if we say 2 is not equal to 1, then the answer will be true because 2 is not equal to 1. So, hope you found that all fairly straightforward. I'm going to set you a little challenge here. What I'd like you to do is, using the input function that we used in the last lesson, create an input which asks the user to enter their name. Okay, and then I want you to create an age limit variable, set that to a value, and then you need to check the age which the user has entered against the age limit. If age is greater than or equal to the age limit, then I want you to set a variable called old enough to true. However, if age isn't greater than or equal to age limit, you need to set the old enough variable to false. So it sounds fairly straightforward, however, you're going to encounter an error. The error will be from the input function because when you enter text into the input function, guess what you get back? You get a string back. And so you're going to be comparing an age, which will be an integer, against a string. So how do you think you will solve this problem? I'll give you a clue. You're going to need to convert your string to an integer. The age which the user entered needs to be converted to an integer. Now, we've already converted integers to strings using the str function. So you can Google the solution to this, or you can take an educated guess. What I'd recommend in most situations is if you think you can take an educated guess, try that first, because That tends to make the knowledge stick better than if you've just looked it up. If you've been and looked something up, you tend to end up going back and looking up the same thing a few times. But if you've actually guessed it, if you've put some thought into it, then the knowledge tends to stick a bit better. That's what I think anyway. So anyway, enough rambling from me. What I need you to do now, pause this, have a go at it, always have a go at it. Don't just skip to the solution. Come back and see how I solve the problem. Okay, here we go. Create an input which asks for the age. And so I'm going to need to store the result of that. I'm going to need to restore the return value of that in a variable. So age equals an input. Please enter your age. Okay, we also need an age limit variable. So I will set an age limit of 18. Then we need to check a conditional, use a conditional to check age against age limit. So now the way I've explained it here, it says set old enough to true if age is greater than or equal to age limit. What I tend to do is go for the least number of conditions that are being checked. So an alternative to this is to check if age is less than age limit. Okay, I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's just move this line up. If age is less than age limit, so if age is less than age limit, we're actually setting that one to false. So old enough equals false. Else, if age isn't less than age limit, then obviously it's greater than or equal to. And so in that scenario, we can set old enough equals true. And in a minute, I'll show you another way where we can reduce our conditionals by another step. Okay, else set to false. And then we just need to print old enough. So I'll scroll down here a bit. So print, and this is where we shall see our error. Print old enough. Okay, over to the terminal and let's run this. Please enter your age. So I'll enter it to a high one first. We'll say 60. Okay, so this is the error. And remember what I said about errors? Read the last line first because that'll give you the greater clue. So type error, which means our data type. There's a problem with our data type. Less than is not supported between instances of string and integer. So the result of input, the age is a string and our age limit is an integer. So this is how you solve that problem. What we need to do is take the result of this age, which will be a string, so we can change this to age string, and then we can set age equals, and where we use the str function to convert a integer to a string, now we're converting a string to an integer. Let's have a guess. int maybe, and if I enter age string, it's highlighted in green, so that tells me that it's a legitimate function. And what I'm going to do now is just run the code again. Please enter your age, and it is true. I am old enough, and so what I shall do is have another go and enter an age which is not old enough. So we'll put 14, and the answer is false. So how did you get on with that? Hope you had a go at it. I hope you managed to have an educated guess and come up with the same solution as what I did. I'll just show you a couple of other things now. So we didn't need to take this step of also creating an age string variable and then setting and then converting and changing to age. What you can do is you call it inlining, where input is returning us a result. We can catch that result inside another function and convert it to an integer inline, which means that we don't need this and we don't need this. Then for the age limit, what you can actually do is set a default. Okay, and so what we can do is we can say that we're going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt to start off with. And so we will set a default value of old enough equals true. Okay, and then we will only change it to false if it turns out that age is less than age limit, which means we don't actually need this part of the else conditional, and we can remove a conditional from our code. I'll not go into that in too much depth right now, but the less conditionals you have in your code, the more certainty you have in your code. So it's always good to remove the number of conditionals. And like the way I did this, rather than checking the other side of the conditional where it's greater than or equal to, if you can just check one thing, just check if something is less than, it just makes your code that little bit more robust in the long run. But I'll not flabbergast you with all that stuff just yet. Further on in the course, these things, the more Python you learn, the more programming you're doing, you just pick up on this stuff naturally anyway. And writing less code is a lot better than writing more code. Always remember that. Less code is best. Okay, and so that pretty much wraps this one up. Hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you've learned something, had a go at everything. Not sure what the next lesson is going to be about yet, but it'll be good. Alright, in this one we're going to have a look at a brand new data type, and that is lists. Up to now we've looked at integers, floating point numbers and strings. Those three types all have one thing in common, and that is they can only hold one value. Lists, however, can hold multiple values, and multiple values of different types. So for example, they can hold numbers, floating point numbers, strings, and all of the other recognized Python data types. So let's have a little example and then you'll have a better idea of what I mean. So let's create a numbers variable. Okay, and we are going to assign this to a list, and the list syntax is this: opening and closing brackets, and then you put your items inside of those brackets. So this is just going to be a list of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. What do you spot there about the way I've created that list? The individual items are separated with commas. So that's about as much as you need to know regarding the syntax. So opening square bracket, closing square bracket, separate each item with a comma. And so let's go and print this out. Print numbers. Okay, Python, and then the file, by the way, is called lists-intro, and that is in the Learn Python folder. Forgot to mention that. Okay, Python lists intro, and so there we have our list: 1, 2, 3, 4. And like I say, lists can also contain strings. So what we'll do is we'll create a names list, and so we shall have Gary, we shall have Catherine, and we shall have Jackson, and then we'll print out names. So over to the terminal, Gary, Catherine, Jackson. And like I say, well, in fact not like I say because I've not told you this yet, but lists can contain mixed values. So there I've just shown you one list which contains numbers and one list which contains names or strings. However, lists can be combined of all the recognized data types. So we'll call this one lists, we'll call this one mixed, and so we'll have a floating point number 5.5, and we'll have an integer 100, we'll have a string, and we'll just call this example, and then you can have lists inside of lists. So what I'm going to do is I can just use the variable. I'll add our names list to our mixed list, and so we'll go and print this out. And as you can see, so I'll talk you through this just so that you recognize the different parts of the syntax. We have 5.5, 100, example, and then you'll notice that these next values, they're inside the square brackets because that is the item in the list. Okay, so these are all classed as one item in the list. So 5.5 is an item, 100 is an item, example is an item, and the list containing the names is an item. Not individually Gary, Catherine or Jackson. It's the actual list containing it's the actual list which is classed as the item. So we say that this mixed list has 4 items, even if one of those items is itself a list. Okay, hopefully that was clear enough for you to understand. Let's have a look at something called indices. So, lists are indexed, i.e. they have a numerical value which represents each item, and the numerical values start at 0. We call it zero indexing. It's used in all programming languages, and so the first item in a list will be item 0. The second item in the list will be item 1. Let's have a look at our names. I'll just drag this down here. And so let's have a visual representation of this. So the first item will be classed as item 0. The second item will be classed as item 1. The third item will be classed as item 2. And the order that an item goes into the list, it retains that order forever. Unless other items are added to the list or items are removed from the list, they will keep the same position in the list. And so that means that I can actually grab an item at a given index in the list. And the way I do that is by using square brackets, so names, and if I want to grab item 2, Jackson, all I do is using the variable names, I add on the square brackets, and then I'm saying I want item 2. And so we shall print this out and go down to the terminal, and as you can see, I get back Jackson, who was number item 2 in the list. Like our other data types, strings, numbers, etc., we can use functions which operate on them. So if I want to know how many items are in a list, I can actually use a function called len. L-E-N. We've actually seen it before when we looked at the length of a string. You can actually use that function, and I'll talk more in detail about why you can use this on strings in a later lesson, but you can actually use that same function on lists. So let's see how long our names list is, and we shall print this out, and it's got 3 items, so the length will be 3. So don't confuse length with indexing, totally different things. Okay, len tells you how many items are in the list, how many letters are in a string, etc. So let's go and run this, and as you can see we have 3, which is correct. And we also have methods, and so if you remembered strings, we had methods like the lower method, which obviously you can't lowercase a number, so the lower method only belonged to the string data type. And so for lists we have something called append, and what that does is it adds an extra item to the end of the list. So if we want to add an extra name to the names list, we would do names. If I hit dot, it shows you a list of all the different methods which are applicable to lists. And so names, if I hit tab, and then what shall we do? We shall have a name called Faisal. Okay, and all I need to do is run that, and then if I print the names list, we should now see that Faisal has been appended onto the end of the names. So Gary, Catherine, Jackson, Faisal. So important to remember, Faisal will add it on to the end of the list. There are methods which will add things onto the beginning of the list, but we'll go more into functions and methods and other more advanced list related things in a later lesson. Struggling to get my words out then. Okay then, let's finish off with a little challenge. I'm just going to hop over to Amazon. Okay, and so when you look at products on Amazon, you'll notice that they have star ratings. If I hover over these stars, you'll see a bunch of different ratings. Okay, you can see how many of each stars they have, and here it gives you the average out of 5. Okay, and so that is what I need you to try and figure out in this challenge. So over in the lesson file, I've created a list called stars, and it contains items which are numbers between 1 and 5. A bit of a clue, we've already looked at something called len, which will tell you the length of this list. What I want you to do is figure out how to calculate the average star rating. So you're going to need that len function. You're also going to need another function, but I'm not going to tell you what that function is. In fact, I'm going to give you no more information whatsoever. I think you should have a good idea how to solve problems like this now, so I'm just going to leave you to it. Give that a go. When you've given it a go and you're happy with your solution, come back and see how I solve this problem. Okay, so we're going to need the len function. The way you calculate the average is you add up all the numbers and divide that by that. When you add up all the numbers, you call that the sum, and then you divide that by the number of numbers, i.e. the length. And so we'll call this variable average rating equals. So we need to add up all the numbers in the list. The way we do that is with a function called sum, S-U-M, and then we pass in our variable for our list, or we pass in our list, and then we divide that by the number of items in the list, which we get with len. And again, we need to pass in stars to that. Okay, and then I'm just going to drag this print statement down here, and we shall print average rating. Okay, over to the terminal, and we get 3.4. So how did you do? Hope you had a go at it. Be great if you got it correct. Don't worry if you didn't, just go back, have a look at how I came up with the solution, and make sure that next time you face this kind of challenge, you're able to complete it. Okay, in the next one, we're going to work on something called slicing. Congratulations on getting this far. If you're getting to grips with the basics and you're feeling fairly confident about what you've learnt, then I'd say that you're well on your way, and you're certainly at a level where you can now go and tackle the full course. The link to that course is below this video in the description. If you have any questions, then please feel free to reach out to me in the comments below. I'll see you there.